Hello, my name is Steve, and I'm a teacher leader. Which is not something I would have been comfortable saying 5 or 6 years ago when I probably was a teacher leader but wasn't comfortable saying that. So what I'm going to talk about today and what my paper was about was the process that brought me from being somebody who didn't feel I had anything to offer to the people around me or other people in the profession to somebody who does a lot of different things and is very comfortable to be up here at AERA saying, hi, I'm a teacher leader. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little about what's at stake. And this isn't something I wrote on my paper, but I've been thinking about a lot in the past few days. So I think what's at stake when we talk about teacher leadership is whether or not whether or not expertise is something that will exist in isolated pockets, be it in the classroom or in the heads of academics at places like AERA, or whether expertise is something that will be shared through a networked system with as many people as possible. So that's thing one, I think, is at stake. Number two is how this term teacher leader will be used. I'm scared that we're at a moment when teacher leadership as a term, capital T, capital L, is getting a lot of attention. And I'm scared, like many of the ideas I love in education, it's about to be co-opted by people who have other goals for it. Much like small schools, which I love being co-opted, much like performance assessment seems to be co-opted. When I read the US DOE Project Respect proposal that came out this week, I also fear that teacher leadership is being co-opted. I was just out for lunch with Barnett Berry, who runs the Center for Teacher Quality and runs the Teacher Leader Network, which I'm a part of. And he described what Project Respect does is basically seeing teacher leaders as lieutenants who are going to carry out marching orders from other people. And I want to be very clear, that is not what we are talking about when we are talking about teacher leadership. When we talk about teacher leadership, I think we are talking about 5 things. Teacher leaders are people who support through collaboration, mentoring, and coaching, as all these people do. It's about 40% of my scheduled time at my school is I work with a novice teacher and co-teach a class with her. Teacher leaders are people who create and share knowledge, as I'm doing at the moment. Teacher leaders are people who advocate from a position of the people who are actually affected by policy. I am part of a group that we have called Insightful Social Studies at insightfulsocialstudies.org that is fighting very strongly against proposed New York State history standards that we think are bad for teaching and bad for kids. Teacher leaders are people who develop the tools of our trade. As John talked about, we are both working on developing assessments to be used across New York City. We are people who write curriculum. We are people who can share these things with other people when asked. And finally, teacher leaders are people who create the spaces where learning actually happens. We do this in our classrooms every day, and some of us have been lucky enough to get actually to create schools. I had the great pleasure this year of opening a brand new public high school in New York City called Harvest Collegiate High School, along with a team of 11 teachers. And then we get to do this amazing thing where 125 kids come and learn from us every day. And that's the type of stuff we want teacher leaders to do. We don't want teacher leaders to do just what their principal is telling them to. We don't want teacher leaders to be the person who follows marching orders from the district. We want teacher leaders to be people with agency who actually exist from a position of knowledge and expertise and share that with others. So I want to talk through the process by which that can happen. And I can argue there's basically 3 things that need to happen. First, we need to recognize novice teachers. Second, we need to create spaces where teachers can practice being a teacher leader with relatively low stakes. And third, we need to recognize and compensate teachers through formal leadership opportunities. And I'm going to talk through my experiences at each of these stages. So as I said, I was somebody who 6 years ago was very uncomfortable considering myself a teacher leader. I remember my principal at the time, a guy named Mark Sternberg, came up to me and said, Steve, I really want you to go present at this conference. And I said, I have literally nothing that I can teach other teachers. Like, that was my honest response. I was wrong, but I didn't see myself in that way. So what was very important is that people took the time to identify me as a teacher leader. People like the Seed crew, who had this little program for us over the past 2 years, has been wonderful. People like Center for Teaching Quality's Teacher Leader Network. But I think most important for me was what happened at my school, at the Bronx Lab School, where John still works. Under the founding leadership, teacher leadership was very much emphasized. It was something that was talked about in our interviews. It was something that was talked about from day one. And it's not because there was some whole program to develop teacher leaders, it's because we were, at the time, a second-year school, and there was no other choice but to have teachers do the work. Therefore, spaces were developed for us to practice these things. We created a lot of teacher leader roles at Bronx Lab, beyond the traditional ones of department chairs. In the 4th year of the school, my 3rd year there, we created a position called Grade Team Leader. This position was intentionally created to give me and another teacher a leadership opportunity. It wasn't because we needed it as a school, it's because the leadership of the school recognized that we were people who could be developed, and they took the time to develop us, even though we were novice 4th year teachers at the time. Without that space and without the coaching I got as a leader, I would not have been able to make the transition to being an effective teacher leader for a wide variety of people that I am today, or hope I am today. As Mario mentioned earlier, there's a different skill set that is necessary to be a teacher leader. The skills that make me a successful teacher in a classroom rarely are the same skills that make me an effective teacher leader. Because of that, I made a lot of mistakes as a teacher leader at the beginning, and continue to make some, but I hope they're new ones instead of the same old ones. So it was important that my principal identified me as a teacher leader, then created this space for me. It was also important that there's been an increase in informal spaces for teachers to share knowledge and to share practices. The first presentation I ever gave at a conference was at an ed camp, which are very casual, so it felt safe. And had I not gone to ed camp, I wouldn't have been comfortable applying to present at places like NCSS and AERA. There are spaces in places like Twitter and on blogs where it doesn't feel like somebody's really judging you. It's just people doing this stuff, and that allowed me to practice being a teacher leader before I could do it in a high-stakes way. Finally, and I think probably most crucially, is this formal recognition of a spot of teacher leadership. And when I say recognition, I mean title, I mean time, and I mean money. It's important that teachers have the opportunity to come to places like AERA and present, and this can only happen because I have a principal who supports me in taking the time to do it, and the Ford Foundation has generously provided the funding to get me here. That's important. It's important that the New York City Department of Ed is paying teachers to develop these new assessments. And it's important that schools create as many titles as possible to recognize as many teachers, because as Sarah and Joy talked about, every teacher is doing this, and it needs to be recognized in formal ways. So the last thing I want to talk about is what I think the implications of in 3 areas where things can happen. And I want to talk about what principals can do, what policymakers can do, and what the union needs to do. First, as I've said, principals need to create the place and give the support to teachers in these roles, which is a challenge as we have, at least in New York, more and more younger principals. My principal, who I love and is wonderful, she's a year older than me, she's at the same stage that I am. She's figuring out for herself, which is great, and I support, but like she's not yet in a position to support teacher leaders. Like she's still learning to be a teacher leader or principal leader herself. So it's not going to come from principals in all situations, then it has to come from other places, which is where policy would come into it. So we need to have other formal supports, like the ones created by Maria and Cheryl for us. They can network teachers, bring them together. Money is always a wonderful thing that helps make this happen as well. Last thing I want to talk about is the union. And I'm my school's union rep. I'm a big union guy. But one of the things that makes this work a challenge is that union contracts need to become more dynamic. I'm in a situation right now where New York City wants to pay me a lot of money to support teachers, and they can't because there's not a mechanism to do it. So if we're actually going to make this happen, this needs to be something that unions or districts are bringing to the negotiating table. I don't think it's going to be anything anyone has a problem with, but we're going to have to get beyond this. Every person gets paid the exact same amount. There needs to be different levels of work that needs to be recognized in different ways. Thank you.